My husband went to the bank every Tuesday at exactly 2 p.m., and if that sounds like the opening line of a sermon, it's because Martin treated routine like faith. For 38 years of marriage, he never missed it. Not when we had an ice storm that turned our driveway into a skating rink, not when he had the flu, and I begged him to stay in bed. Not even the Tuesday our smoke alarm wouldn't stop chirping, and I was ready to throw the thing into the backyard and let the squirrels finish it off. When I asked why, he'd kiss my forehead in that practiced way that made me feel both loved and slightly managed, and he'd say the same thing every time. He was keeping our future secure. I believed him, because I'm 71, not naive, but I did grow up in the era where a husband handling money was considered a perk, like indoor plumbing. Martin was a payroll supervisor for a manufacturing company in Madison, Wisconsin, and numbers were his comfort food. He talked about budgets the way other men talk about barbecue. Our bills were paid early, our taxes were filed before I'd even found the folder, and anytime I tried to look at statements, he'd smile, slide them back into his drawer, and tell me I deserved peace, not paperwork, like he was doing me a favor by keeping me uninformed. The day he died, I was at Woodman's, holding 2 cartons of eggs and pretending this was the hardest decision I'd make all week. My phone rang, and it was my son, Caleb, and his voice sounded wrong, flat, and careful, like he was stepping around broken glass he couldn't see. He told me I needed to get to St. Mary's Hospital, that his dad had collapsed at work, and by the time I got there, Martin was already gone. A massive heart attack, fast enough that the doctor said he likely didn't feel much. People love to say that, like it's a gift, and maybe it is. But it didn't feel like a gift to the person left behind holding a purse full of grocery coupons and no idea what happens next. I didn't cry at the funeral, and everyone decided I was in shock, which is what people say when they don't know where to put your face. The truth was simpler and stranger. I felt relief, not because I hated him, because I didn't, but because somewhere deep down I could finally breathe without waiting for him to tell me everything was handled. I just didn't know what I'd been holding my breath for until 3 days after we buried him, when a plain white envelope showed up in my mailbox with my name typed on the front and no return address, like it was trying to be polite about ruining my week. Inside was a single page from Lakeview Federal Bank, and the tone was the kind of sympathetic professionalism you can only learn by practicing in front of a mirror. They expressed condolences. They referenced the terms of the lease. They informed me I was listed as the secondary holder of a safe deposit box in my husband's name, paid through the end of the year, and asked me to call to arrange access. I read it 3 times because the first time my brain refused to accept the sentence, the second time it tried to turn it into a mistake, and the third time it finally landed. We had a safe deposit box, and Martin had never mentioned it, not once in 38 years. I called the number, and the woman on the phone stayed kind in the way people do when they're trained to be kind, confirming that yes, the box was registered to Martin Hart, with Evelyn Hart as co-holder, and yes, I could access it with proper identification, and would Thursday at 10 a.m. work. Thursday was 2 days away, and I said yes because I didn't trust myself to wait longer. I've learned that when your life cracks open, procrastination doesn't make it less messy, it just gives it time to smell worse. I spent those 2 days moving through our house like it belonged to someone else, opening drawers Martin had organized, looking at files he'd labeled in his neat handwriting, and finding everything exactly where it was supposed to be, which somehow made me angrier than chaos would have. Caleb came by Wednesday evening still wearing his work clothes, tie loosened, eyes red, and he sat in the kitchen chair Martin always claimed as if the chair itself might explain something. He told me he'd gone through his dad's office files at work to help me get ahead of things, and he said it with that serious tone adult children use when they're trying not to panic their parents. Then he pulled out a folder and slid it across the table, and inside were bank statements and account summaries I'd never seen. He asked me if I knew Martin had multiple checking accounts, and I told him no. We had the joint account, the one I could see on my phone, the one I'd been told was the whole story. Caleb pointed to balances that looked like typos, an account that had been empty for months, another that had been closed, and one with $40-some sitting in it like a joke. My stomach tightened because even I knew what our retirement should look like after a lifetime of secure future speeches. Caleb swallowed hard and said he couldn't find it. Not the retirement, not the savings he assumed existed, not the cushion Martin promised was there, and he kept talking. but all I could hear was the sound of years rearranging themselves in my head. That night, I lay in the bed Martin and I had shared for decades, staring at the ceiling, replaying every Tuesday bank trip, every gentle hand pat, every time he'd said, "Don't worry about the money stuff, Evie, I've got it." And for the first time, I heard the other sentence underneath it: "You don't need to know." Thursday morning arrived cold and gray, and I dressed carefully, choosing a blazer like armor, because if I was about to meet the truth, I wanted to look like someone who could handle it. Caleb offered to come, and I told him no, because whatever was in that box had been kept from me on purpose, and I needed the first look to be mine. Lakeview Federal's downtown branch was all glass and polished tile, the kind of place that smells like air freshener and quiet rules, and the manager, a woman named Denise Calder, greeted me with the sympathetic smile of someone who's seen grief and money share a room before. She led me to the vault, used her key and the key they'd prepared for me, and placed the metal box in my hands with a carefulness that felt almost like pity. She pointed me toward a private room with a small table and chair, and when the door shut behind me, the silence landed heavy, because suddenly it wasn't about accounts or statements, it was about the fact that my husband had a locked space in the world I didn't know existed. I set the box on the table and stared at it long enough that my hands started to ache, and then I turned the key, lifted the lid, and saw folders stacked inside, thick and orderly, like Martin had planned for this moment the way he planned for everything else. My fingers hovered over the first folder, and I caught myself thinking absurdly that maybe it was something sweet, a love letter, a surprise, proof that the man who kept me out of the money was at least keeping something for me. Then I pulled the folder free, saw the label in his handwriting, and felt my throat tighten as the words came into focus, because it wasn't a gift at all. It was a category, and it was one I'd never heard spoken in our home. I opened that first folder with hands that didn't feel like mine anymore, and the papers inside were crisp and neatly clipped, because Martin never met a disaster he couldn't organize. The label read Holdings, which sounded comforting until I started reading and realized the holdings weren't ours. Not the way I understood ours, because every account was in his name only, and every page was a small, polite obituary for money that had died. There were brokerage statements filled with red numbers, margin calls, notices about positions liquidated, and something called a private investment that looked like it had been marketed to men who liked to feel smarter than everyone else at Thanksgiving. I didn't recognize the firm names, and I didn't recognize the account numbers, and I didn't recognize the version of my husband who thought it was reasonable to gamble with decades of work like he was playing cards at a bar. I sat down, because my reveals have always been practical, and because the room tilted slightly in that quiet way it does right before you embarrass yourself by fainting in a bank. The second folder was thicker, and it was labeled Property, which in our house meant the roof that leaked in spring, the oak tree that dropped acorns like it had a personal grudge, and the garden bed I'd fought with for years. This folder meant something else. Home equity loans, 3 of them, pulled against our house, our paid-off humble little house with the creaky stairs and the kitchen cabinet that sticks unless you lift it just right. Each loan had paperwork, copies of applications, repayment schedules, and my name printed beside his, like I'd been a willing participant. The totals made my vision blur: $265,000 in debt, stacked in careful layers, as if spreading it out makes it less real. My chest tightened, and I had to take slow breaths through my nose the way I used to during labor, which felt like a cruel full-circle joke. I wasn't delivering a baby, I was delivering myself into a financial nightmare I didn't consent to. I told myself to stop, to close the box and walk out and come back with Caleb and Denise and a priest maybe, because surely that would make it easier. But then I opened the third folder, and the little last thread of denial snapped so cleanly I almost heard it. Credit cards, not his, mine. Applications and approvals, statement after statement, and on each one, my name, my social security number, my forged signature, copied in a way that wasn't perfect but was good enough for a company that just wanted someone to pay. There were cards I'd never seen, charges I'd never made, balances that made my stomach clench, and the total sat there at the bottom of a summary page like a taunt. $92,000. The paperwork even included a verification call log for one account, a note about a phone conversation where Mrs. Hart had confirmed personal details. I stared at that line for a long time because it wasn't just fraud, it was performance. My husband hadn't simply taken my name, he had worn my voice. I sat there with my elbows on the table and my hands pressed together like I was praying, except I wasn't asking for guidance. I was asking my body not to fall apart in a bank's private room. The weird thing about betrayal is that it makes you review your entire life like you're scanning receipts, trying to spot the moment you should have returned the purchase. I thought about the times Martin insisted on picking up the mail first, the way he'd helpfully shred things so I wouldn't have to, the way he'd handle calls from unknown numbers and tell me it was spam. I thought about how I'd admired his efficiency. I wondered how many times I'd thanked him for hiding the knife he was using. At the very bottom of the box, under the folders, was an envelope that didn't match the others. Thick, cream-colored, my name written across the front in Martin's careful handwriting. Not printed, not typed, written. It felt intimate in a way the statements didn't, and that made me angry, because of course he'd choose to be personal only when it benefited him. I opened it slowly, like I was handling evidence at a crime scene, and inside was a letter, 2 pages, folded once, the edges aligned perfectly. Even his confession had to be tidy. Evie, it began, and that alone made my eyes sting, because he hadn't called me that in years unless he wanted something. He said he was sorry, and then he admitted the kind of sorry that has a body count. He'd made a strategic investment 5 years ago, something he was certain would pay off, and when it didn't, he told himself he could fix it. And every Tuesday at 2 p.m., he went to the bank to restructure and move things around and buy time. He wrote that he'd taken out loans against the house to keep us afloat. He wrote that he'd used credit in my name because it was the only way, because creditors trusted a clean history, because he couldn't admit he'd wrecked his own. He wrote that he loved me, that he never meant for me to know, that he thought he'd solve it before it touched me. He wrote that by the time I read the letter, we were probably broke, and the house might be at risk, and my credit would be compromised. Compromised, like it had taken a bad photo and needed flattering lighting. I folded the letter back up and put it in the envelope, because if I kept reading it, I might do something dramatic, and Martin would have hated that. Denise was waiting outside the room, and when she asked if I was all right, I told her the truth because I didn't have the energy for social lies anymore. I said no, I wasn't all right, and I needed copies of everything in the box, every folder, every page, and I needed the name of a lawyer who handled identity theft and financial fraud. Denise's face changed, not shocked exactly, more like resigned, like she'd seen this movie before and knew it didn't end with a hug. She told me she'd make the copies herself and have them ready by the afternoon, and she said she was sorry in a voice that sounded like she meant it, which oddly made me want to cry harder than the documents did. By the time I drove home, the sky was the color of wet concrete and my hands were locked around the steering wheel, like I didn't trust myself not to drift into oncoming traffic. Caleb's car was already in my driveway. He met me at the door, jaw tight, eyes too bright, and he said he'd found something else in Martin's files, something he hadn't wanted to tell me over the phone. He said he'd been looking for the life insurance policy, because that's what responsible children do when a parent dies. They look for the safety net they assume exists. I didn't even let him finish. I told him there wasn't one, because after what I'd just read, it would have been out of character for Martin to leave behind anything that worked the way it was supposed to. Caleb stared at me and asked how I could know, and I walked past him into the kitchen, set the copies Denise had already handed me in a thick envelope on the table, and told him to sit down, because the story was bigger than a missing policy. He read through the documents in silence, the only sound the scrape of paper and the hum of the refrigerator, and I watched his face cycle through disbelief, anger, and something like grief all over again. When he reached the letter, his hands shook, and he stopped long enough to swallow hard, like he was trying not to vomit on my placemats. Finally, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "This was bad, really bad," and I told him I knew, because there's a certain peace that comes from having your worst fear confirmed in writing. Caleb asked how I was so calm, and I surprised myself by answering honestly. I told him anger was useless in the moment, and what I needed was a plan, because rage doesn't call creditors, and it doesn't file reports, and it definitely doesn't fix your social security number once someone else has been using it like a coupon. The lawyer Denise recommended was named Mariah Chen, and she worked out of an office in Milwaukee, a bright place with clean lines and a waiting room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, which felt like an insult considering my life smelled like panic. Mariah listened without interrupting while I laid out the safe deposit box, the loans, the credit cards, the forged signatures, and Martin's letter. When I finished, she leaned back and told me directly that this was spousal financial abuse, and she didn't say it like a slogan or a buzzword. She said it like a diagnosis. She told me it wasn't just bad judgment, it was fraud, identity theft, a pattern of coercion disguised as care, and she told me we could fight it, but it would take time, and it would cost money I didn't have, and creditors don't like forgiveness as much as they like payment. I asked what we could do if Martin was dead, and she said we could prove I wasn't complicit, that I didn't sign, that I didn't benefit, that my name had been used as a tool. I agreed to everything she laid out because I didn't see another option, and then she asked me one question that made my skin prickle. She asked if there was anyone else in the family who might be affected, anyone whose information Martin had access to, and the moment she said it, my mind went straight to my daughter, Lauren, the child who adored her father, who still kept his old birthday cards, who said he was the steady one whenever she and I argued. I told Mariah I didn't know, and I hated how weak that sounded, because the truth was, I didn't know anything anymore. That night I called Lauren, and when I told her what I'd found, she went quiet so long I thought the call dropped. Then she said, in a small voice that made me feel like the villain in her story, that there had to be an explanation, that Dad wouldn't do that he loved us, and I told her love doesn't cancel consequences, but she didn't want to hear it. She said I was speaking badly about him, that grief was making me paranoid, and she hung up before I could respond. An hour later, Caleb called and told me Lauren had called him crying, insisting I was wrong, insisting I was ruining Dad, and I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at Martin's empty side, and felt the first true emotional loss that wasn't money. I was losing my daughter to the version of her father she needed to keep intact. 2 weeks passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork and Mariah's calm instructions, and then the first official letters started arriving. Notices, demands, warnings, all addressed to me, all written in that cold corporate tone that assumes you deserve whatever happens next. One afternoon, as I was sorting mail at the kitchen table, my phone buzzed with a notification from the bank app Martin insisted I never needed, and it was an alert about a new inquiry on my credit report. I stared at the screen because we'd already filed fraud alerts, which meant someone was either very stupid or very confident. The inquiry listed a lender I didn't recognize, and beside it was a note. Application pending. I called the lender immediately, expecting to hear it was a mistake, expecting to be told the fraud flag stopped it, expecting apparently to be handed a miracle. Instead, the woman on the phone asked me to verify my identity and then told me casually that the application had been submitted that morning with a copy of my driver's license attached. I felt my mouth go dry because my driver's license had been in my wallet all day, and yet there it was, being used again. I asked her where they got the image, and she said it was uploaded through an online portal from an IP address in Madison. I looked up from the table at the hallway that led to Martin's office, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something colder than grief settle into my chest, because someone wasn't just cleaning up Martin's mess. Someone was continuing it. The next morning, I woke up with that strange clarity that only shows up after a night of no sleep, the kind where your fear has already done its worst and there's nothing left to protect. My body felt older than it had the day before, heavier, like it had absorbed the weight of all those papers in the safe deposit box, but my mind was sharp in a way it hadn't been for years. I made coffee I barely drank, sat at the kitchen table with the stack of copies from the bank, and started organizing them myself, not because I thought I could outsmart the situation, but because I needed to reclaim at least one habit Martin had taken from me. Control doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it starts with paper clips and labeled folders. By mid-morning, Caleb came over again, this time without asking, his jacket still on, his expression tight like he'd been bracing himself during the drive. He sat down across from me and said he'd spent the night looking through his father's old emails, the ones tied to the nonprofit, because something about the missing funds had been bothering him in a way he couldn't explain. He told me he'd found correspondence between Martin and a board member I barely knew, a man named Russell, full of casual jokes and late-night messages about temporary gaps and short-term solutions, the kind of language people use when they're trying to convince themselves nothing permanent is happening. Caleb said he didn't know what it meant yet, but it didn't feel accidental, and hearing that made my stomach drop again, because I'd hoped foolishly that the damage ended with Martin. Later that afternoon, Mariah called to tell me the fraud reports were officially filed and that the first round of creditors had been notified, which sounded reassuring until she added that this didn't mean they'd stop calling. She said companies like to pretend compassion exists until it costs them money, and then they remember contracts instead. I thanked her and hung up, and less than 10 minutes later my phone rang again, this time from a number I didn't recognize. And when I answered, a man with a smooth voice introduced himself as a recovery specialist and asked how I planned to resolve my outstanding balance. I told him I didn't recognize the account, and he laughed lightly, like I'd told a joke, and said he had my signature on file. My hand clenched around the phone so hard my fingers hurt, and when I told him I'd reported the account as fraud, his tone shifted just enough to feel like a warning. He said we'd let the process play out, which sounded less like patience and more like a threat. That evening, Lauren showed up unannounced, standing stiffly on the porch like she wasn't sure she was welcome in the house she grew up in. She looked tired, her eyes red, and she didn't hug me when I opened the door, which hurt more than I expected. She said she'd come because she needed to hear everything again, from the beginning, because what I'd told her on the phone didn't match the father she knew. We sat at the table, and I laid out the documents one by one, watching her face change as she read, watching denial slowly give way to something quieter and more painful. She asked questions I'd already asked myself 100 times, about why I hadn't noticed sooner, about why I trusted him so completely, and I answered honestly, because lying now would only deepen the fracture. I told her love can make you lazy with vigilance, and that trusting someone doesn't feel like a choice while you're doing it. When she reached the forged credit card statements, she stopped, her fingers trembling slightly, and she whispered that she needed to check something. She pulled out her phone, logged into her banking app, and went very still. She didn't cry right away, which scared me more than tears would have. She just stared at the screen and said flatly that there was a card in her name she didn't recognize, with a balance just under $25,000. She said she'd assumed it was a glitch, something she'd deal with later, because Dad had always said banks made mistakes. In that moment, the betrayal spread, widening its reach, and I felt a surge of anger so sharp it almost felt useful. Martin hadn't just stolen from me, he'd planted bombs in his children's lives and trusted death to hide the evidence. Over the next week, the house filled with paperwork and tension, phone calls layered over each other, voices repeating the same explanations until they felt hollow. Lauren stopped defending her father, but she didn't forgive him either. She existed somewhere in between, grieving the man she thought he was and resenting the one he turned out to be. Caleb became my quiet anchor, handling logistics when my hands shook too much, sitting with me when the silence got heavy. One afternoon, while sorting through another stack of mail, I found a notice addressed to a storage facility on the south side of town, and the return address matched the key I'd found weeks earlier. I held it for a long moment, feeling the familiar pull between wanting to know everything and wanting to know nothing. The next day, I drove there alone, telling no one, because some confrontations need witnesses and some need privacy. The facility was dull and practical, rows of metal doors and the smell of dust and oil, and when the clerk checked my ID and handed me the unit number, I felt oddly calm. The lock clicked open easily, and inside I found boxes stacked neatly, labeled in Martin's handwriting again, each one a small capsule of intention. I opened the nearest box and found files tied with string, all related to the nonprofit, donation records, altered spreadsheets, and handwritten notes that made my skin crawl. It was clear now. Martin hadn't just lost money. He'd been moving it, borrowing from places he thought wouldn't notice, and using my name as insulation. I closed the box carefully, locked the unit, and walked back to my car without looking back. The decision settled in my chest before I consciously made it, firm and uncomfortable, because I knew what came next wouldn't just expose Martin's actions, it would dismantle his reputation completely, and with it, whatever comfort remained for my children. Revenge, I realized, doesn't always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like telling the truth to people who never asked for it. I started the engine and sat there for a moment longer, knowing that once I spoke, nothing could be put back where it was, and wondering whether justice would feel like relief or just another kind of loss. I waited 2 days before doing anything with what I'd found in the storage unit, partly because I needed to be sure I wasn't acting out of pure anger, and partly because I wanted to see who else might panic before I made my move. Those 2 days told me more than any document ever could. The nonprofit's office called twice asking if I'd come across any paperwork of Martin's that might help them close out his role. One of the board members, a woman who used to send Christmas cards addressed to Martin and Evelyn, our financial rock, left me a voicemail that was warm, cautious, and terrified all at once. No one asked how I was doing. They asked what I knew. That alone made my decision feel less cruel and more necessary. I met with Mariah again and told her everything, including the storage unit, the altered spreadsheets, the notes that showed money being shifted just long enough to look like it hadn't disappeared. She listened, didn't interrupt, and then said something I hadn't expected. She said this crossed from personal fraud into institutional damage, and that if I sat on it, someone else could very easily decide I'd been complicit by silence. That word again. Complicit. It landed heavier than guilt, because guilt implies choice, and I hadn't chosen any of this. Mariah explained my options carefully, not pushing, not dramatizing, just laying out consequences like items on a table. I could turn everything over to the authorities and let the fallout happen. Or I could try to negotiate quietly with the nonprofit and hope they'd clean it up without public exposure, which would protect Martin's name, but leave questions unanswered. I surprised myself by laughing, short and dry, because protecting his name had been the theme of my marriage, and it hadn't protected me at all. I told Caleb and Lauren that night. Caleb nodded slowly, already understanding where this was headed, while Lauren went very still, her hands clenched in her lap. She asked me if I was trying to punish their father, and the question hurt more than anything she'd said so far. I told her I wasn't punishing him, because punishment implies he'd feel it, and he was beyond that. I told her I was protecting myself, and maybe, belatedly, protecting the truth. She cried then, quietly, and said she didn't know how to live with people knowing this about him. I told her people already knew pieces, they just didn't know how they fit together yet. The next morning, I called the investigator Mariah had mentioned weeks earlier and asked for a meeting. Sitting across from him in a plain office with beige walls and a humming fluorescent light, I felt older than my 71 years and strangely steadier than I had in months. I handed over copies, explained the storage unit, walked him through the timeline as best I could. He didn't react much, just nodded and took notes. But when I finished, he said this confirmed suspicions they'd already had and thanked me for coming forward. Thanked me. That word settled differently than sympathy ever had. News traveled faster than I expected. Within days, the nonprofit announced an internal review. Within a week, Martin's name was quietly removed from their website. People I hadn't heard from in years started sending careful messages that said things like, "If you need anything," without specifying what that might be. One woman from church stopped me in the grocery store and squeezed my arm a little too hard, telling me how brave I was, which made me want to tell her bravery had nothing to do with it. Stubbornness did. Lauren stopped answering some calls. Caleb took over most communication for me, screening messages the way parents usually do for children. The creditors didn't stop calling, but the tone changed. Less confident, more procedural. 2 accounts were officially frozen pending investigation, which felt like a victory until I realized frozen doesn't mean erased. It just means paused. I kept working my part-time shifts at the library, reshelving books and answering questions about printer jams, and I found an odd comfort in problems that could be fixed with instructions taped to the wall. Real life didn't come with those. One afternoon, sorting mail again, I found a handwritten note slipped into my box. No stamp, just my name. Inside, a single sentence. "You didn't have to destroy everything." No signature. I sat at the table staring at it, feeling the familiar pull to apologize, to soften, to explain, and then I folded it up and threw it away, because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel responsible for making other people comfortable with the truth. The real consequence arrived quietly, not with headlines or confrontation, but with distance. Lauren pulled back, not from me exactly, but from the whole story, and I could see how hard she was working to hold on to some version of her father that hadn't touched any of this. I let her. Revenge had its limits, and one of mine was my children. Still, when I lay awake at night, I wondered whether choosing truth over silence would cost me that relationship permanently. By the end of the month, the house was still mine, my credit still bruised but breathing, and Martin's reputation no longer intact. I stood in the kitchen one evening, looking at the empty chair across from me, and understood something uncomfortable but solid. I hadn't just survived what he did. I changed the ending. Whether that made me stronger or lonelier was a question I didn't yet know how to answer. By the time the investigation became official instead of whispered, I'd stopped flinching every time the phone rang. That alone told me how far I'd moved from the woman I'd been a month earlier, the one who waited for permission before opening drawers and apologizing for asking questions. The state auditor contacted me first, calm and efficient, explaining that the nonprofit's records showed a pattern that couldn't be explained away by poor bookkeeping, and that my documentation from the storage unit filled in the missing logic. Martin hadn't just borrowed, he'd rotated funds, delayed reporting, and relied on trust to keep everyone from looking too closely. Hearing it laid out, that plainly felt strange, because it sounded less like my husband and more like a case study, and yet every detail fit him perfectly. The unexpected consequence came from a place I hadn't anticipated: the house. Not foreclosure, not yet, but attention. Once the loans were officially flagged as fraudulent, the bank froze any action on them, which meant no payments due, no immediate threats, but also no refinancing, no selling, no clean resolution. I was stuck in place, legally safe and practically immobile, living in a home that was mine and not mine at the same time. Friends called it a win. I called it suspended animation. Safety, I learned, doesn't always feel like freedom. Lauren came over one evening without warning, quieter than usual, and sat across from me at the kitchen table where everything in our lives now seemed to happen. She told me she'd been asked to give a statement, not because anyone thought she was involved, but because Martin had used her personal information once, years ago, to verify a family account. Hearing that made my chest tighten, not with surprise, but with anger sharpened into something cleaner. Lauren said she'd agreed to cooperate, and then she looked at me and asked, very softly, if I'd ever loved him the way she did. The question wasn't fair, but life rarely is, and I answered honestly. I told her I'd loved the man I thought he was, and that loving an illusion still counts, even if it doesn't excuse what comes after. She nodded, not fully convinced, but less defensive than before, and when she left, she hugged me in that careful way adults do when they're afraid of breaking something fragile. Caleb handled the practical aftermath with a steadiness that made me proud and a little sad, because it meant he'd grown up fast without my noticing. He helped me set up a new bank account in my name only, at a branch Martin had never stepped into, and when the teller asked if I wanted overdraft protection, I almost laughed. The balance was modest, embarrassing even, but it was honest, and for the first time in decades, I knew exactly what was in it without asking anyone. Control, it turns out, is addictive once you remember how it feels. The nonprofit released a public statement eventually, vague but firm, acknowledging financial irregularities and promising reform. Martin's name was mentioned once in a footnote tone that said everything without saying too much. Some people sent sympathy, others sent silence. One former board member emailed to say she hoped I could find peace now that the matter was being addressed, and I deleted it without replying, because peace wasn't something she got to assign me like a gift card. The final choice arrived quietly, like most real ones do. Mariah called to tell me I could pursue civil action against Martin's estate, limited as it was, to formally clear my name and recover a small portion of what was lost, but doing so would lock everything into public record, searchable, permanent. No discretion, no softening. I sat with that decision longer than I expected, because revenge isn't always about damage. Sometimes it's about visibility. I thought about the women who'd trusted the nonprofit. I thought about my children. I thought about the version of myself who'd spent years being grateful for ignorance. In the end, I agreed to proceed, not because I wanted more punishment, but because I wanted an ending that couldn't be rewritten later. The process was slow and unsatisfying, and the financial recovery was minor, but the judgment mattered. It said in clear language that I hadn't consented, that my trust had been exploited, and that love doesn't transfer liability. When the papers arrived, stamped and final, I placed them in a folder of my own and slid it into a drawer I now open freely. Life didn't reset after that. I still wake up early. I still check the locks twice. I still sometimes reach for my phone to tell Martin something mundane before remembering I don't do that anymore. The difference is that now, when the quiet settles in, it doesn't feel like absence. It feels like space. Space I didn't know I was allowed to occupy. A month after it all ended, I stood in my kitchen holding a set of house keys in my hand, considering whether to change the locks again, not because I needed to, but because I could. I realized then that the real revenge wasn't exposure or paperwork or even truth. It was the fact that I no longer needed to ask myself what he would have wanted, and that freedom came with a question I'll be answering for the rest of my life. When you finally see everything clearly, do you owe loyalty to the past or only to yourself?